Bonjour! Thank you for joining me today for Princess Storytime. Today I'll be reading from 50 famous fairy stories. This is a story I'd never heard before. It's called The Miller Boy and the Cat. There was once a miller who had neither wife nor children, but he did have 3 apprentice boys who worked for him. The miller was growing old and wished to leave the mill to one of his apprentices. In order to discover which lad would be best, he determined to test them. "Go out into the world," he said to them one day, "and bring back a horse. The boy who brings the finest horse shall have the mill." The 3 boys started out together. They walked all day and that night lay down in a cave to sleep. When the 2 oldest boys were sure the youngest was sound asleep, they quietly stole away, for they did not wish to have him tagging along after them. When the youngest boy woke in the morning, he found he was alone. "How can I ever find a horse alone?" he thought. Not knowing what else to do, he walked on into the wood. "What are you doing here, Hans?" asked a voice near him. Hans, surprised to hear someone calling him by name, looked around and saw a small black and white cat. "You cannot help me," Hans said. "I know what you want," the cat said. "You are looking for a horse. If you come and work for me for 7 years, I will give you a horse." The miller's boy was surprised at this offer, but decided to accept it and see what would happen. Away they went through the wood to the cat's home. They entered a fine house, and the miller's boy was served all sorts of good food. All the servants were kittens. They whisked up and down the stairs and all about the house, keeping it as neat as a pin. When evening came, they played on many different instruments to while away the hours until bedtime. At length, the kittens led the miller boy to his room and helped him take off his clothes. Then they blew out the light and scampered away. In the morning, the kittens were on hand again to help him dress. After breakfast, the cat gave Hans an axe, a wedge, a saw of silver, and a mallet of copper, and told him to cut wood into little pieces for her. Day after day, Hans went on cutting wood and seeing no one but the black and white cat and the energetic kittens. One day the cat gave Hans a silver scythe and a gold whetstone and said, "Go and mow the meadow and spread the grass to dry." Hans did that and everything else that the cat requested. He began to think that it was almost time for the cat to give him his horse. One day he asked the cat about it. "There is one more thing I want you to do," she said. "Build me a little house. When it is finished, you may have your horse." Hans worked hard at the house, and in what seemed such a short time, it was done. "Come with me," said the cat, "and I will show you your horse." She took him to the stables where there were 12 horses, each one as beautiful as the next. She watered them and fed them and said to Hans, "You may go home now, and in 3 days your horse will come to you." Hans started for home. He had nothing to show for all of his 7 years of labor, not even a new suit of clothes. When he reached the mill, he found that the 2 older apprentices were there ahead of him. One had brought back a lame horse, and the other a poor beast blind in both eyes. When they saw Hans was empty-handed, they laughed at him and called out, "Where is your horse?" "It will be here tomorrow," Hans replied, but he didn't speak very firmly, for he was beginning to wonder about it. "Ha ha," laughed the older lads, "a horse that drives itself home. That is a fine one, surely." Hans made no answer and went into the mill. The miller would not let so shabby a boy into his clean mill, and poor Hans had to sleep that night in the shed where the geese were kept. Early in the morning, a fine coach drew up to the door of the mill. A lovely princess opened the door and stepped out. She went straight to the mill and asked for Hans. He was so ragged and dirty, the miller said, that we could not have let him inside. He slept in the shed with the geese last night. "Give him these boxes," the princess commanded, "and then bring him to me." The miller obeyed and soon discovered that the boxes contained a velvet coat, a plumed hat, and other princely garments. While Hans was dressing himself, the princess asked to see the horses the 2 other miller boys had brought. They showed her the two sorry horses, one lame and the other blind. Then a servant led in the splendid horse and told the miller that Hans had earned it. The miller had to admit that this was the finest horse that had been in his yard for many a day. Just then, Hans appeared in his new clothes, and no prince could have looked finer. "Hans, look at me," said the princess. "I am the cat you served faithfully for 7 years." But Hans could only stare in love and wonder at her beauty. "Hans," the miller said, "the mill is yours, for you have brought the finest horse." "No," said the princess, "you may keep the horse and the mill, for Hans is going with me." She took Hans by the hand and led him to the coach. They got in and rode away. When they came to the place where Hans had built the little house, a beautiful castle stood in its place. The princess and Hans were married there, and they were both wealthy and happy and never wanted for anything. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you again soon. Au revoir.